The air in the classroom was thick with anticipation, the hum of everyday school life suddenly interrupted by the crackle of the PA system. "Attention, staff and students," the principal's voice quivered, barely concealing an edge of panic. "This is a lockdown. I repeat, this is a lockdown. Follow all procedures immediately." Mrs. Langley, the usually composed history teacher, froze for a second before snapping into action. "Move to the corner, away from the windows," she whispered urgently. 30 high school juniors scrambled to the back of the classroom, huddling together like frightened animals. The lights were switched off, the blinds drawn, and the door locked with a trembling hand. The sound of the lock sliding into place seemed deafening in the sudden stillness. Everyone held their breath as the muffled echo of hurried footsteps reverberated down the hallway. Someone in the corner stifled a sob. Outside, the world had shifted. The cheerful chatter and the faint smell of cafeteria pizza had been replaced by an oppressive silence. But then came the noise. Faint at first, like a distant rumble, but growing louder. It was the sound of doors being rattled, one after another. Someone or something was testing each handle, methodically, as if searching. The students exchanged terrified glances, but no one dared to speak. Mrs. Langley held a finger to her lips, her eyes darting toward the door. The sound grew closer, the metallic jingle of a doorknob being twisted just outside their room. The rattling stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, heavy knock. Knock! 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 It wasn't loud, but it carried an ominous weight that froze every heart in the room. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then came a voice, low and chillingly calm. "I know you're in there. Let me in." Mrs. Langley clenched her jaw, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. No one moved. No one breathed. The voice outside chuckled, the sound unnervingly playful. "Fine, I'll find another way." The footsteps receded, but the sense of relief was fleeting. Minutes crawled by, punctuated by distant noises, more doors being tested, faint thuds, and the occasional muffled scream. Then came the sound no one expected, the classroom phone ringing. It was a shrill, unnatural noise in the oppressive silence, and it made everyone jump. Mrs. Langley hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver. Against her better judgment, she picked it up. "Hello?" Her voice was barely audible. "You didn't let me in." The same calm, chilling voice came through the line. Mrs. Langley's face turned ashen, and she slammed the receiver down, her breathing ragged. From the corner, a girl named Sarah whimpered. The sound seemed to spark a chain reaction. As other students began to panic, their whispers of fear escalating. Mrs. Langley tried to calm them, but her own terror was evident. Suddenly, there was a crash, a window shattering at the back of the room. The students screamed, scrambling to their feet as a shadow loomed outside. A hand reached through the broken glass, fumbling for the lock. Without thinking, Mrs. Langley grabbed a chair and swung it at the intruding hand, the sharp crack of impact echoing through the room. The figure outside hissed in pain and retreated, but not before muttering, "This isn't over." The lockdown lasted for hours, each second dragging on like an eternity. Finally, the police arrived, their presence announced by the sound of heavy boots and commanding voices. The students and staff were escorted out one by one, their faces pale and eyes wide with shock. Later, the police would report that they found no trace of the intruder, only the shattered window and faint, bloody fingerprints smeared across the glass. No one knew who or what had terrorized the school that day, but the real horror lay in the aftermath. Strange things began happening in the weeks that followed. Students reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the hallways, hearing faint knocks when no one was there, and finding cryptic messages scrawled on lockers, "I'm still here." The school eventually closed down, its reputation tarnished by the incident. But the building still stands, abandoned and decaying, a monument to the terror that unfolded within its walls. And if you listen closely, some say you can still hear the faint sound of knocking, echoing through the empty corridor.
Story number 2.
The rain poured heavily against the school's tall, grimy windows, the storm outside muffling the sounds of a bustling Thursday afternoon. Sixth period biology was dragging, the students only half listening to Mr. Bennett drone on about cellular respiration. Then, without warning, the PA system crackled to life. "This is a lockdown. Lock your doors immediately. This is not a drill." The announcement came in a monotone voice, one that no one recognized. Mr. Bennett froze. his expression unreadable. He quickly walked to the door, locking it and flipping off the lights. "Everyone, get down," he hissed, his voice trembling. The students obeyed, crawling under their desks or huddling in the corner. The room fell silent, except for the soft sound of rain and distant thunder. It wasn't until the silence stretched too long that people began to notice something was off. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. No footsteps. No doors slamming. Nothing. Then, a sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hall, each one growing louder and closer. Whoever it was walked with an unnervingly steady pace, as though they had all the time in the world. The footsteps stopped right outside the classroom door. A shadow appeared under the doorframe, motionless yet impossibly large. The knob jiggled softly at first, then harder until it rattled violently. Mr. Bennett signaled for everyone to stay silent, his face pale with fear. Then came the knock. It wasn't frantic or loud. It was slow and deliberate, just 3 heavy knocks that reverberated in the room. The knocking stopped and a voice followed, low and distorted, as if coming through an old crackling radio. "I know you're in there." No one moved. No one breathed. The voice chuckled, a guttural, unsettling sound. "Let me in," it said. Mr. Bennett shook his head, mouthing, "Stay quiet." But then one of the younger students, Abby, began to hyperventilate. The sound broke the silence like shattering glass. The shadow outside the door shifted. "I can hear you," the voice whispered, almost gleefully. Suddenly, the doorknob stopped rattling, replaced by the sound of scraping. It was slow, methodical, like someone dragging a sharp object along the wooden door. A moment later, a deep, jagged gash appeared in the middle of the door. Then another. The scraping grew faster and more aggressive, splintering the wood. Mr. Bennett grabbed a fire extinguisher, his knuckles white as he gripped it like a weapon. But just as the door seemed ready to give way, the noises stopped. The hallway went silent again. The students exchanged terrified glances, unsure if it was over or just beginning. Then, from the back of the room, came the sound of a window sliding open. Everyone turned in unison to see it, a figure climbing through the second-floor window. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, they glowed faintly in the dim light, burning like embers. The thing crouched on the windowsill, its face stretched into a grotesque grin that revealed too many teeth. "Found you," it rasped. Chaos erupted. Students screamed and scrambled toward the door. Mr. Bennett swung the fire extinguisher at the creature, but it moved too fast, darting across the ceiling like a spider. It dropped down into the center of the room, blocking the student's path. Abby, paralyzed with fear, stood frozen in its line of sight. The creature's grin widened as it reached for her, its spindly fingers curling like talons. But before it could grab her, a blinding flash of light filled the room, followed by a deafening screech. When the light faded, the creature was gone. The students and Mr. Bennett stared at the now empty classroom, the only sign of the intruder being the claw marks gouged into the walls and ceiling. The police arrived later, baffled by the account. No intruder was found, no traces of a break-in, just the marks and the lingering sense of dread. The school remained open, but no one stayed late anymore. Months later, Abby woke up in the middle of the night to a sound at her bedroom window. 3 slow knocks.
Story number 3.
The night started like any other late evening practice at Willow Creek High. The cheerleading team was running drills in the gym while the band rehearsed in the music wing. The rest of the school was dark and quiet, the distant hum of the janitor's floor buffer echoing faintly through the halls. Around 8:30 p.m., the lights in the building flickered and went out, plunging the school into darkness. A few scattered gasps and nervous laughter followed, but most assumed it was just a brief power outage. Emergency lights buzzed to life, casting eerie, dim glows down the long, empty hallways. The intercom crackled suddenly, breaking the uneasy silence. "Attention, this is a lockdown. Follow all protocols immediately. Remain silent. Do not leave your location." The voice was male but completely unrecognizable, cold and emotionless. The cheerleading coach, Mrs. Harper, frowned and looked at her phone, but there was no service. She instructed the girls to stay put and started locking the gym doors. In the music wing, the band director, Mr. Ortiz, did the same, ushering students into the storage closet. The heavy door shut with a metallic clang, sealing them in. It wasn't until someone whispered, Who called the lockdown? That the unease started to creep in. There had been no alarms, no announcements from the principal, and no sign of police outside. Then came the first sound, a deep, resonating thud, like something massive hitting the floor. It came from the direction of the main entrance. The cheerleaders froze as the sound echoed again, this time closer. "Is someone in the building?" whispered Claire, one of the freshmen, her voice shaking. Mrs. Harper hushed her, pressing a finger to her lips. The thuds turned into slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the hallways. Whatever was making them wasn't in a hurry, but its presence was heavy, suffocating. In the music wing, the storage closet was deadly silent. The students huddled together, their breathing shallow. Then, from the far end of the hallway, they heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. Mr. Ortiz tried to reassure the students, but his trembling hands betrayed his calm words. The growling grew louder, accompanied by scratching, like claws dragging across the linoleum floor. Back in the gym, the footsteps stopped right outside the doors. The cheerleaders stared at the handles, watching as they began to jiggle violently. "Let us in," came a voice, soft and high-pitched, almost childlike. Mrs. Harper's heart sank. There were no children in the school this late. "Please," the voice whined, dragging out the word. "It's so cold out here." The handles stopped moving, but then there was a loud bang, as if something heavy had been thrown against the doors. The cheerleaders screamed, but Mrs. Harper shushed them harshly. "Stay quiet," she whispered. The banging stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, from above came the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the gym ceiling. Meanwhile, in the music wing, the scratching had turned into pounding. The students in the storage closet clung to each other as the metal door began to dent inward. "Stay back!" Mr. Ortiz shouted, brandishing a broken cymbal stand like a weapon. The pounding stopped abruptly. For a moment it seemed like whatever was outside had gone. Then, from the back of the closet, a chilling voice whispered, "Why are you hiding?" The students screamed as the air grew colder, their breaths visible in the dim light. Throughout the school, the emergency lights flickered, and a deafening, inhuman roar reverberated through the halls. Doors rattled, windows shattered, and the building itself seemed to groan under some unseen weight. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The lights came back on, the intercom buzzed, and the principal's familiar voice crackled through. "All clear. The lockdown has been lifted. You may exit the building." But no one moved. When the police arrived, they found the school empty, save for claw marks on the gym ceiling, deep gouges in the music wing's storage door, and faint bloody handprints leading to the main entrance. No students or staff were ever found. The only clue was the final message left on the intercom, replaying in a distorted loop. "Why did you try to leave?"
Story number 4.
The small town of Elmwood prided itself on its safe, quiet schools. But that changed one rainy Friday afternoon when Elmwood High became the scene of something no one could explain. It began at 2:15 p.m. during 7th period. The sky outside had darkened unusually early, the storm clouds swallowing the late afternoon light. The principal's voice came over the intercom, trembling slightly. "Attention all staff and students, this is a lockdown. Please follow all procedures. Remain silent." The announcement was standard, but something in her tone struck a nerve. Teachers locked doors, turned off lights, and ushered students into corners away from the windows. Nervous whispers filled the classrooms, but in Mrs. Price's English room, the silence was nearly complete. Then they heard it, a faint tapping sound. It started lightly, like fingernails drumming on glass. The students exchanged nervous glances as Mrs. Price crept toward the window. The rain streaked the panes, but there was no one outside. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the ventilation ducts above. "Stay quiet," Mrs. Price mouthed, her face pale. Down the hall in the science wing, a similar scene unfolded. Mr. Callahan's class listened in frozen terror as heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. They weren't hurried, just slow and deliberate, each step reverberating as if someone or something was dragging something heavy. The footsteps stopped outside their door. A shadow fell across the small window. Someone or something stood there. A hand, pale and too large, pressed against the glass. The fingers were unnaturally long, ending in sharp yellow nails. "Let me in," a voice whispered, low and gravelly, as if it had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. The students pressed themselves tighter against the back wall, their breath shallow. The hand withdrew, but the shadow didn't move. It lingered for several minutes before the footsteps resumed, fading into the distance. In the gymnasium, the basketball team, stuck mid-practice, had been ushered into the locker room. The storm outside made the emergency lights flicker, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. "Do you hear that?" one of the players whispered. It started as a faint scratching noise like nails on a chalkboard. Then came a loud metallic clang as if something had hit the lockers. One by one, the locker doors began to slam open and shut on their own. The players huddled together, their coach trying to keep them calm, but the slamming grew more violent. Then a voice, distorted and echoing, filled the room. "You can't hide." Back in Mrs. Price's classroom, the tapping in the vents had turned into banging. Dust rained down from the ceiling tiles as something moved inside the ducts, getting closer. A low growl vibrated through the air, unnatural and guttural. The door to the classroom suddenly rattled, the handle twisting violently. The students screamed as the door shook on its hinges. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. In the hallway, screams echoed from multiple rooms, each one more chilling than the last. The PA system crackled again, but instead of the principal's voice, there was only static, until a distorted voice broke through. "You can't escape. I see you." By the time the police arrived an hour later, the school was empty. No students, no teachers, no staff. The building was silent, save for the dripping of rainwater and the faint creak of swaying doors. The search continued for weeks, but no one was ever found. The only clue was what officers discovered in the gym. A single, blood-red handprint smeared across the wall, with the words "We let it in" scrawled beneath it. To this day, no one knows what happened to the people inside Elmwood High. The building remains abandoned, a local legend whispered about in the dead of night. Those brave enough to approach it swear they hear faint footsteps and soft whispers echoing from within. And sometimes, if the storm is just right, they say the lights flicker on just for a moment before plunging back into darkness.